I was interviewed by Larissa Manderbach on March 9th, 2019. She was 24 years old and born in Germany. Larissa is a student of illustration and also works with her father at his art house, Semina. She loves visual storytelling, be it in the form of still, painted images, or moving ones on the big screen. In the early months of 2018, she was first introduced to Victor Charles Buono when she watched him in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. Ever since she saw him act with Betty Davis and Joan Crawford, Larissa Manderbach has been gathering information of Victor Charles's Hollywood career and life. Out of the blue, she stepped into my life and she interviewed me about my experiences of when I lived with my Uncle Victor Charles in Encino, California, and other important issues surrounding his personal life. This is an oversight of my recollections of my Uncle Victor Charles and other family members and friends throughout his life within the interview. These are my opinions, and I hope I clarified them clearly and accurately because it's important that Victor Charles's career and life be substantially known and understood. Larissa's first questions to me were motivated by Ryan Murphy's mini-series production of Feud on March 5th, 2017. It was a reenactment of the filming of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. Larissa Manderbach sparked the fuse that motivated me to write this book, and this is what was said in our interview. The voice that you will hear of Larissa's questions is my wife Sandra, because Larissa is in Germany and not here.
What did you think of your uncle's portrayal in Ryan Murphys Feud? And were you or anyone from your family, maybe your Uncle David, in any way consulted?
The actor who portrayed my Uncle Victor Charles in the Ryan Murphy series Feud is Dominic Burgess, and he happens to be a friend of mine on Facebook. Feud was premiered on television on March 5th, 2017. And it was a great surprise to me and other family members. I was very curious of how they would present Victor Charles within the story of producing Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. I lived with Victor Charles in Encino, California around 1965 when I was 13 years old, and I went to Castel Bortola Middle School. Victor Charles was 26 years old at that time, and it was 3 years after he performed in Robert Aldrich's Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. I remember him as a giant man, with a gentle spirit who spoke softly and walked gracefully throughout the house. Dominic Burgess was born in the same year Victor Charles died on New Year's Eve, 1982. Burgess has a similar physical stature like him and his soft-speaking voice, but what was missing was Victor Charles's cutting wit and quick, sharp tongue. You would never easily win a verbal debate toe-to-toe with him. He was just too damn smart to lose. Within Feud, they opened the closet of his homosexuality. I wasn't startled one bit by that raw sexual scene in the film, for I always knew he was gay. There were a few family members who frowned on that startling discovery in Feud, though. As for me, it was a reality seeing it being unburied after all these years, when leaving people guessing. Is he gay or is he not? To my knowledge, there was no family member sought out to be a consultant of his life in Ryan Murphys' production of Feud.
I guess my question is, even though it's a private topic and I feel kind of rude, are you sure he was gay?
It's not rude of you asking if he was gay or not. Yes, he was. I believe so. And he kept it quiet. Was he attracted to women and did he take them out on dates? My answer is no. The only 3 women he cherished in his entire life were his mother, Myrtle Bell, his grandmother, Keller, called Granny Grunts, and Old Globe Theater costumer, Peggy Kellner. Peggy was a gem, talented, intelligent, and very personable, and she was one of his fondest friends. I once visited Peggy Kellner's home with her 4 or 5 dogs sitting around the floors in her historic haunted house. Yes, she did have a real haunted house. You mentioned to me that various people believe he was a ladies' man. Well, if he heard that, he'd have a jolly great laugh. The whole time I lived with him, he never had a girlfriend brought into his house. The only woman inside the house was his mother. My Uncle David Francis lived there, and he was 6 years older than me, and we shared the same bedroom directly off the kitchen. There also was an old black man named Sherman. He was as nice as can be, and he was the helper around the house, and his living quarters was outside in a long silver trailer. Victor Charles was not the type of gay man who flaunted and pranced proudly in people's faces. He was an amusing charmer, though, with witty barbs, tossing them around to keep people happy. Victor Charles was never in a closet or out of one, for that matter. But if someone ever cornered him on it, he probably would say, "Oh, what's the problem being gay? A kiss to kiss, a hug is a hug, lovers share intimacy, and I too want to be loved."
I would like to keep talking about his upbringing and your family. Is it correct that his paternal grandparents were from Italy and his maternal grandmother from Ireland, while his maternal grandfather was from Germany?
Victor Charles is the son of Victor Francis Buono, and his father and mother came from northern Italy. His mother is Myrtle Bell Keller, and her mother was Myrtle Class Keller, and her family came from Ireland, and her husband Carl Keller's family came from Germany. When I was 5 years old in 1957, I remember the Buono family living near South Mission Beach in San Diego, California. They had a quaint single-story house on Mission Bay. It was lovely and peaceful in those days. I remember when my father, mother, and my 2 sisters and I came to visit their house and we heard passionate voices coming from the kitchen. It was my grandmother, Myrtle Bell, who I always called Grandma Myrt, and my great-grandmother, Myrtle Class Keller, who always called Granny Grunts, and they were sitting at the kitchen table having a jolly good fight over something that they soon forgot. The one thing I loved most about visiting their house was the energy and liveliness that filled every room. I loved being in the kitchen, especially when Grandma Myrt was cooking fried chicken and her wonderful out-of-this-world French fries. Victor Charles would come and go throughout the day, but David Francis was always there to play with me. Step-grandfather Victor Francis was absent most of the time while working at his Bell's Bonds business in downtown San Diego. In 1957, everything seemed to be perfect for the Buono family. Victor Charles was an up-and-coming actor at 18 years old, playing leading roles at the Old Globe Theater, and Victor Francis had a prosperous Bell Bonds business that same year. Mission Bay was paradise on those sunny days playing in the sand. And when Victor Charles came running into the house and putting up the film screen to show his newest amateur movie for all of us to see, and it felt like the Academy Awards had arrived at the Buono house. It was perfect in those days when passing through into 1958. But when 1959 rolled around, that was when the nightmares began.
Is it true he built a house for his parents in Encino?
That isn't correct. Victor Charles didn't build a house in Encino, but he did purchase one there. That was the home I lived in with Uncle Victor Charles, Uncle David Francis, and my Grandma Mert. It was a beautiful home surrounded by trees, and it was up on an isolated hill. The interior of the house had numerous exotic woods from all around the world on the floors, walls, and ceilings. On the exterior of the house, it was a unique-looking brick that made it look like a castle.
And I read that his mother lived with him most of the time. I had wondered if it was just because they got along so well, or if it had to do with his father being involved with the Marable killing. I was quite shocked when I came across these reports. Do you know how that affected the family?
My Grandma Mert lived with him everywhere. He loved her and wanted to care for her always. In regards to the Marable murder on December 27, 1958, in Hillcrest, California, Victor Francis was caught up in a life-changing crisis that dramatically influenced the whole Buono family. Ryan Murphys' mini-series, Feud, possibly opened up a dark and buried secret of Victor Francis Buono. On the internet, there is an official legal document titled People versus Buono. It is a document of the robbery and death of Antonio Marable in 1958. Tony Marable was a young member of the Purple Gang Mafia in Detroit, Michigan in the 1930s, and he later became the head mafia boss of San Diego in the 1950s. Victor Francis wasn't the one who killed him, but he was part of the conspiracy of robbing him though. My father, Louis M. Erreca, also called Sonny, was a police officer in San Diego at that time of the Antonio Marable murder, where my father fits into the Buono family as being the son of Myrtle Bell Keller. He was born in October 19, 1927, and his father was Louis Rupert Erreca. The marriage between Louis Rupert Erreca and Myrtle Bell didn't last very long, and it wasn't until my father was around 6 years old in 1933 that he went to live with his mother and Victor Francis Buono. When my father heard of the arrest of his stepfather, Victor Francis, he was emotionally stunned when he went into the San Diego County Jail to speak with him. Being a San Diego police officer made it all the more difficult for him because of the shame and the way he felt about that horrific event in his life. That was a tragic moment for Victor Charles when he was attending college at Villanova University in Pennsylvania. During this time period, there was no information on the internet that clearly described what was really happening within the Buono family between the years of 1958 and 1959. Between the years of 1957 and January 1959, my Uncle Victor Charles was performing in productions at the Oak Globe Theater, and he had left Villanova University and came back home, and he started attending at the University of San Diego. Victor Charles soon stopped going to the University of San Diego, and that was the time he started acting in television and motion pictures in Hollywood. The Buono family was still living near South Mission Beach in San Diego, California during that time period. It's clear to me that Victor Charles, at 20 years old, became the bread maker of the Buono family, and many doors of opportunity in Hollywood were ushering him into his professional career.
So Victor Francis Buono was out of the picture for at least 7 years. I did read, though, that he did manage his son, at least for a while around 1970. Is that correct? And I know now how far apart your father and Victor were age-wise. How much younger is David?
I'll first address how much younger David Francis is. He was born in 1946 and was 7 years younger than Victor Charles, who was born on February 3rd, 1938. My father, Sonny, was 11 years older than Victor Charles when he was born, and he was his half-brother. My step-grandfather, Victor Francis, was sent to San Quentin State Prison around 1959, and he served a sentence of approximately 9 to 10 years, and then he was released around 1969. When I saw my step-grandfather after he was freed from prison, Victor Charles was moving from his monkey house that was located at Yamashiro Chinese restaurant in Hollywood. It was a small dwelling cut into rock, and Victor Charles's bed laid above the small living room. There was a small kitchen, and it had floor and ceiling windows that overlooked the Grom's Chinese Theater below on Hollywood Boulevard. In the monkey house, there were 3 high bookshelves stacked full of books and looking like a library, and there was a desk where he wrote his poems for his book. It could be verse. My father, Sonny, and I were visiting there at that time, and Victor Charles told us when we first arrived that his neighbor was over there to the right. It was Raymond Burr's house, who played the lawyer in the television program Perry Mason. I was asked to drive back to the monkey house alone with my step-grandfather, Victor Francis, to pick up more items. It's quite a distance driving from Malibu Beach to Hollywood Boulevard, being around 31.5 miles, and taking around 1 hour to get there. While we drove along the Pacific Ocean, there wasn't any conversation between us. I just looked out of the car window and thought about what it must have been like for him being in San Quentin State Prison. I didn't know what to say to him, and apparently so didn't he. I obviously couldn't ask him, "Grandpa, how does it feel being free from prison?" It was just impossible for me to come up with any proper topics of conversation. I hoped he would break the ice and ask me something like, "How's school going for you, Wayne?" Or, "Do you have any girlfriends now?" Anything would have been all right instead of silence. And I remember looking over at his profile, trying to perceive what he was thinking about, too. There was nothing but a blank expression on his face. Looking back over the years, I realize now that we were just, unfortunately, strangers after his long time in prison. He didn't know me, and I didn't know him. And after 9 long years in prison, he may have had a habit of keeping his thoughts to himself. My step-grandfather, Victor Francis, did assist my Uncle Victor Charles's acting career in the early 1970s, and he spent the rest of his years visiting or living with Victor Charles and my grandma Mert at their Apple Valley Ranch near Victorville, California.
Since you said he also later lived with Victor Charles at his Apple Valley Ranch and his mother Myrtle Bell, does that mean your grandparents stayed a couple after all that time apart?
When my step-grandfather, Victor Francis, was released from prison around 1969, I wasn't informed of where he was presently living. But I do know he wasn't living with my grandma Mert as a newly happy married couple. I do know they did remain friends for the rest of their lives. My Uncle David Francis was living with his first wife at Manhattan Beach, next to Hermosa Beach and near Redondo Beach in California. David told me his father, Victor Francis, would just pop into his house carrying grocery bags of food and stuff them in his refrigerator up to the brim. I always thought that was a very kind gesture by my step-grandfather's behalf. It was in the early 1970s, and I didn't know exactly where my step-grandfather was living at that time. Victor Francis died on May 17, 1981, at the age of 73 years old. I don't know if he was living or just only visiting at Victor Charles's Apple Valley Ranch leading up to his death. I was living in Glendale, California, outside of Los Angeles in 1978, and around that time I called Victor Charles's house to see if I could come by for a visit at his Apple Valley Ranch. It was my grandma Mert that picked up the phone and said Victor Charles was out of town and wouldn't be back very soon. I soon thereafter took my family to Boyne City, Michigan to live. I remained in northern Michigan, and I was a disc jockey at WWPZ 1340 in Petoskey in 1981. I never forget that day on 1st, 1982, when I went to the radio station and pulled the AP Associated Press ticker newsfeed to record on tape. But suddenly, I saw Victor Charles's name. At first, I wasn't surprised because I often saw his name popping up in new television programs and motion pictures. But this time was different, and it read, Victor Buono collapses and is dead at 43 years old. I was stunned. I immediately got on the phone and called my father Sonny, asking, "What happened to Victor Charles?" He said, "Victor is gone."
The photo of Victor throwing a baseball was taken at his Malibu home, if I remember correctly. He was often on Perry Mason. Were Burr and him friends?
Yes, that was my Uncle Victor Charles who gave me that photo of him, dressed in a baseball uniform and winding up like a pitcher to strike me out. That photo was taken on the Malibu beach bluff, overlooking the Pacific Ocean at his home. I'll always cherish it. I believe Victor Charles had a friendship with Roman Burr far back when they were working together in the Perry Mason television program, and it continued on when being next-door neighbors.
Did he have a couple of good Hollywood friends? I only know Robert Mitchum and him were really good pals.
Yes, Robert Mitchum. And he were friends, and he enjoyed smoking a little marijuana on occasion with him. They were in the motion picture The Wrath of God, 1972. There are two other friends of his that many people may not know. He was actor-comedian Wally Cox, who supposedly had an intimate relationship with Marlon Brando in their early years of being actors. One can only imagine what kind of relationship Victor Charles had with Wally Cox. That, of course, is buried with both of them. And if they did have a sexual relationship, so what? Actor Robert Strauss, who was in the motion picture Stalag 17, won an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor in 1953. Robert Strauss was a friend of Victor Charles, and he came over to his home in Encino, California, for his Halloween night party on October 31st, 1965. I was living there at that time, and Strauss and I were good buddies throughout the evening. He was a very funny and kind man, and he treated me like his son.
Wally and Victor starred in Seduction of a Nerd in 1970, and it had lots of cheesecake nudity. It was truly bizarre, and personally I didn't like it. Do you think he made this movie for monetary reasons?
My Uncle Tony Edwards once told me that as soon as money flowed into Victor Charles's hands, it would be gone immediately. Money was always a great issue for Victor Charles, though. By the way, my Uncle Tony wasn't my real uncle, but he was part of the Buono family ever since he was a young teenager in the early 1950s. His birth name was Anthony Edwards, and he and his mother lived nearby the Buono house in South Mission Beach, San Diego, California. His mother was severely ill, and she explained to my Grandma Mert that she wouldn't be alive much longer, and she could take her little Anthony into her home when she died. That is exactly what happened. Anthony Edwards was made part of the Buono family for the rest of his life, and he was always my Uncle Tony. We were just talking about money, and did Victor Charles make cheesy motion pictures like Seduction of a Nerd only for monetary reasons? I would have to say yes. Television programs and cheesy motion pictures kept a roof over Victor Charles's head, but it was his acting on the stage that brought him the greater respect and fame. Many people may not know his theatrical background of acting on stage at the Old Globe Theater, which is one of the most 5 prestigious theaters in America. To this very day, whenever they're looking for an actor to play the role of Falstaff in Shakespeare's Henry IV, Victor Charles is the measuring stick and standard for that particular role. My Uncle Tony once said, when Victor Charles was playing in the role of King Tut in the 1960s television Batman series, whenever he got home, he would be screaming, "They're making me a whore!" And that is exactly what they were doing. Victor Charles was a classical trained actor. And when he was on stage, he was a mountain, and he demanded everyone's attention. His amusing wit and gorgeous tone of speech was addicting to the ears and eyes to everyone sitting in the theater. It was 1959 that changed everything. Victor Charles was a budding stage actor on the climb, and his notoriety was rising, and he was only 20 years old. He was a giant among older men, and he was only a young man. His father made very bad decisions, ruining his personal life and ushering Victor Charles into being the provider of their home, clothes, food, and electoral bills, and providing a roof over his mother and younger brother's heads. A world of weighty responsibility came crushing down upon his shoulders at 20 years old. In 1959, everything was going well for him as a young man, but suddenly he was taken away from his youth and forced to become a man. There is much more to say about 1959. It was the ruin of a family, and this particular 20 years old then had to knit everyone back together. I don't fault him for the cheesy roles and motion pictures he acted in over his short career, because he didn't run away and hide or give up or cry like a baby. Victor Charles worked, and he worked for money because his mother and brother needed a roof over their heads and food for their bellies. Victor Charles was a professional actor, and he made his mark in Hollywood history. Not bad for a 20 years old that was 6'3" and weighing 350 pounds.
To take your Uncle Tony in was a generous move from your grandmother, and I've read about Victor's fear of driving a couple of times, and that he held dinners for his friends who then had to draw a slip from a hat that determined who had to drive him on different days of the week. One 1966 Valley News article is about Victor finally overcoming his fear of driving. I've also read that he specified in contracts for his gigs that a 4-door car or a limousine had to pick him up. I suppose that wasn't a vanity thing, but simply for comfort since he was a big man.
In around 1970, my Uncle Victor Charles came to El Cajon, California, where I was living with my father, Sonny, and my Uncle David Francis was with him. David Francis was doing all of the driving at that time. Victor Charles had a brand new black Cadillac, and he wanted David and me to take it to a car wash on Main Street. After it was clean, we picked up a girlfriend of mine and we drove around like kings. My Uncle Tony told me that when Victor Charles finally got up the courage to get his driving license, he didn't just drive around Hollywood, but he drove all the way across the numerous states of America. He forever was obsessed by being behind the wheel instead of being a passenger only.
I came across all his theater reviews in the newspaper archives. It was so amazing. They were brilliant, especially the ones for his Falstaff basically just consisted of gushing praise. I had the time of my life reading them all. I see he's still listed as one of the best ever to have played that role. Ron Miller interviewed Victor once and wrote in his book, "You ain't heard nothing yet," that Victor was such a powerful stage performer that I don't believe his movie and his TV fans ever experienced the real Buono if they hadn't seen him live on a theater stage. Reading that makes me a young fan who can't see him live anymore, and I'm happy and sad at the same time.
I fortunately had the opportunities of seeing 3 of Victor Charles's performances. The first time I saw him performing on stage was when my father Sonny took my sister Renee and me to the Desert Inn in Las Vegas, Nevada in 1969. He was in a musical of all things and the production of Many Happy Returns, starring with Broadway stars John Wright and Pat Carroll. After his performance, we were sitting in a restaurant booth with him in the Desert Inn Casino. The restaurant was full of customers, and Victor Charles pointed out two strange-looking characters who were sitting alone, and he said to us, "See that man and the other woman over there? The way they're dressed, you would think they're bums, but they're millionaires." He personally knew who they were, and I've never forgotten his important lesson of not making conclusions by the way people look and how they're dressed. In 1974, I was living in North Park in San Diego, California, near the Old Globe Theater, and I had one of my most magical theatrical moments in my life. I was informed that my Uncle Victor Charles was in the rehearsal in Shakespeare's King Henry IV, Part 2. I got in touch with him and asked if I could visit, and he naturally said yes. At that time in my life, I never imagined ever becoming an actor, director, and playwright. I was quite naive in so many ways. I remember telling Victor Charles about the street theater group called Indian Magic, who performed for free in the Zorro Gardens in Balboa Park. His rehearsal was beginning, and Victor Charles told me to find a chair in the theater. I didn't quite know what I would be seeing. Soon, the director ordered the actors to take their marks on the stage, and it began. The stage lights were lit, the actors' voices were heard, and the visual images of people prancing around a very large human figure on the middle of the stage was my Uncle Victor Charles. He was playing Falstaff with his amusing and authoritative dignity. It was at that moment that drove an inspiring message into my heart to become an actor in my future. I was so completely impressed by his performance, I don't think I was able to ask him one intelligent question later. He did offer me a wise piece of advice, softly saying, "Wayne, there are many great actors, but so few great playwrights. Be a playwright." I never forgot that. And when I wrote my first theater script in 1983, I thought of that special day when my Uncle Victor Charles was acting at the Old Globe Theater. When 1978 rolled around, I went to see my Uncle Victor Charles acting at the Solari Theater in Beverly Hills, California, in the production of The Last of the Marx Brothers Writers. He played the leading role of Jimmy Bryce, an ex-vaudevillian comedy writer who lies in bed in his beaten-down hotel room and is soon surrounded by delusional images of his ex-wife, and Julius Dumont, who plays all the Marx Brothers lookalikes. I remember sitting next to comedic actor Marty Feldman that evening. As I sat watching the play and enjoying all of the comedic antics, verbally and visually, my Victor Charles and the other two actors, there was a clear sadness somehow that I felt. Perhaps it was because Victor Charles was lying in bed dying instead of being the energetic Falstaff I once watched before. What I didn't know that night was I wouldn't ever see him again acting on a theater stage. Years later, in the early 1990s, I met up with executive director Craig Knoll of the Old Globe Theater. We were standing outside the theater, and Craig Knoll shared his disappointment of the production, The Last of the Marx Brothers Writers, to me because he had hoped it would have been staged on Broadway, but it never happened. He also shared he wasn't surprised that Victor Charles died so young. He knew Victor Charles as a teenager, learning the ropes of becoming an actor at the San Diego Junior Theater, and when he directed him at the Old Globe Theater stage in Volpone in 1956, he knew he was highly talented and he could go far. He said to me, with Victor, everything had to be big. He smoked big cigars, ate big meals, and drank more than he should. And he ran as fast as he could. There was no slow walking or doing little things in Victor's life.
I had wondered, since Victor had such a great speaking voice, could he sing? He said in one interview he could sing and dance, but didn't like to show that off on TV, so he did his poetry. And when I found out he was in musical productions, I figured he could have at least been able to hold a tune. Was he a good singer?
For the time I lived with Victor Charles in Encino, California in 1965, I never heard him sing, whistle, or dance through the house or outside on the lawn. There isn't any doubt in my mind that he wasn't capable of singing and dancing, though. The one member of the family that did play music and sang was his grandmother, Myrtle Glass Keller, who I called Granny Grunts. She was living with us for a short while, and she had brought her organ piano and played and sung often in the living room. She was quite old then, in her mid-80s, and she soon died in 1969. Was Victor Charles a good singer? Well, knowing him, if he truly had a voice of an opera singer and could dance like Fred Astaire, he wouldn't have kept it from his fans because he adored hearing their applause.
In general, what were his hobbies and interests besides acting, poetry, and Shakespeare? You mentioned he used to shoot his own movies. He was known as a gourmet chef and had pets like his Piguana Tosca. What did he like to read? Did he have a favorite TV show or movies you know of?
The only times I ever saw him reading was when I would walk in the den and he was lying on the sofa reading a script. I never saw him reading paperbacks, magazines, newspapers, or hardback books. I do know that Victor Charles had read numerous books during his early life, though. It was in the late 1950s at the Mission Bay House in San Diego when Victor Charles was shooting amateur films. My father, mother, two sisters, and I would be visiting at the Buono house, and Victor Charles would be setting up his movie screen against the wall and then turning on his movie projector. His cast was made up from his Old Globe Theater actor buddies. Now, one of his very best acting friends around 1961-62, it was Jonathan McMurtry. He, too, was one of Victor Charles's chauffeurs when he didn't have a card license. It was McMurtry who also drove him everywhere in those early days of his acting career in Hollywood. I had lunch one day with Jonathan McMurtry in Hillcrest in the early 1990s to hopefully hear some memorable gems of their early relationship in 1962. We mostly talked about acting and theater because I was an actor then, and I wanted his advice for what steps I should take in the future. As for Victor Charles being a gourmet chef, if that's true, he had to have learned it later on in his life. The only person cooking meals in the Encino house in 1965 was definitely my Grandma Mert. I have a newspaper clipping showing Victor Charles and his mother in the Encino house standing near a gorgeous buffet on their kitchen table. It probably was for publicity reasons for his fans. I could be wrong, but I never saw any food like that before while living in Encino. One thing we can agree on, my Uncle Victor Charles did like to eat, even though I never saw him cooking or washing dinner plates. Pets, you say? Oh yes, we did have a German Shepherd dog named Sergeant at the Encino house in 1965. I love that dog. He was my buddy, and I would wrestle him on the floor in the den and on the outside lawn, pretending he was a lion and I was a Christian in a Roman arena. He always looked huge to me, but he was incredibly gentle. You could put your hand in his mouth and he would never bite you with his sharp teeth. Sergeant was Victor Charles's dog, and while I was there, he was my dog too. My Grandma Mert had a small Chihuahua that I can't recall its name, and that is probably because I really didn't like that feisty little dog. It always sat near my grandmother's feet, and if I got too close, it would growl and threaten to bite me. In those days in Encino, I don't believe we ever had a television at all. Not in the den, living room, or anywhere else. Maybe Victor Charles had one, hiding one in his bedroom next to my Grandma Mert's bedroom. But I never watched a television program or movie while living there. That does seem odd that a professional actor like Victor Charles wouldn't even have a single television set. During that time period, there was so much to do though. My uncle David Francis and I worked at Domingo Italian Deli on Ventura Boulevard in Encino, California. Celebrities would often come in there to purchase their delicious food. I remember being behind the counter, and when looking up to greet the customer, it was actor Dick Van Dyke. As for hobbies, I'll always remember sitting with my Uncle Victor Charles, watching him gently and meticulously painting Easter eggs. At my young age, I was amazed by how this mountain of a man could be so gentle when holding a fragile egg while painting his masterpiece, Easter egg.
I've also read that his weight loss was one of the reasons he didn't get movie roles in big productions anymore, because they wanted his old look. Do you think that this is true, and did the family ever give him a hard time about his weight?
Victor Charles was tall and heavy from the very beginning when he was in elementary school. We all know how young children can be quite mean against those who are fat. He most likely got his share of seething insults throughout his first 15 years of living as a tall and fat young boy. Victor Charles was definitely not the ideal leading man when first acting on a stage or in his personal life. There were always plenty of handsome and physically fit young men to take girls out on dates. And there are many girls who wouldn't ever want to be seen going on a date with a very big and fat boy. I can only imagine the anguish he had to endure. The things most young men didn't have, like Victor Charles did, was his incredible intelligence and his exquisite talents to make people laugh. Victor Charles was smart enough to know he wasn't going to be the romantic lead in a motion picture or on the theater stage. He did have a few cheesy films under his buckle playing the lead, but for the big money productions and classic productions, he would always be overlooked every single time. Going back to 1959, Victor Charles had established himself as a prominent actor at the Eau Globe Theater. He was respected and looked at in awe by his wonderful, heavy stature and height that he carried ever so gallantly well. With television and motion pictures leading into the 1960s and 1970s, with the sex revolution abounding throughout the world, there weren't many leading roles for a tall and fat man actor. Leading men had to be handsome, and leading women had to be beautiful if they expected to work as stars. Victor Charles did what he could do, and he never dreamt his figure would have a 32-inch waistline too. You asked me, did any family members give Victor Charles a hard time over his weight? I suppose at certain times in his life there might have been an ugly word or here or there. I couldn't name any particular family member who did, but we know how things go in families at various times. I do know this. When Victor Charles was living at the Mission Bay house near South Mission Beach, my grandma Mert put a lock on their refrigerator once to keep Victor Charles from eating them out of the house. It's commonly said, fat people eat for comfort. Well, if that is true, my Uncle Victor Charles would disagree, because he dreaded eating in restaurants where people could look at him and think, "Oh my, look at that horrible fat man. He should go on a diet."
I love his character parts, even though he was usually made up to look kind of goofy or older. But I was also extremely delighted when I watched all his roles as beatniks and gangsters on the Private Eye series he was on between 1960 and 62. I also loved his role as Count Manzeppi on the Wild Wild West very much, since he got to play an attractive gentleman villain.
I completely agree, Larissa. That particular character, Count Manzeppi, was one of Victor Charles's very best roles on television. Count Manzeppi brought out the real Victor Charles as being the witty and hilariously funny person he was. In 2015, I visited with my Uncle David Francis and his family in Lakewood, California, and within their family room there was a painting of Victor Charles as Count Manzeppi hanging on their wall.
Did the fact he often looked older bother him? Did it ever lead him to any funny or strange situations?
I remember riding in Victor Charles's black Cadillac with him. He was behind the wheel driving through Malibu Beach, California, on the way to the cigar store where he purchased them. When we got there, I'll never forget walking through a crowd of shoppers with Victor Charles that day. He was tall and large, and the expressions on the shoppers' faces made me want to laugh. It appeared to me that they never saw a man like him, with long hair and a beard, and he was gracefully walking with the spirit of a royal king while mingling along with his common people. Being by his side was like being on a huge ocean vessel, cutting through the rolling waves. People seeing him stepped aside. Did his size and age look bother him? When he was growing up as a young boy, I think he would say yes. But as an adult, he knew what he looked like, and he knew who he was. And frankly, he couldn't give a damn what others thought.
You just mentioned 2 more movies Victor did with Robert Aldrich, and another question I had written down is in relation to that. I've read that Aldrich signed Victor to a 5-year, 5-movie contract, but did they only do 3 together? What happened?
That is definitely up to one speculation to what happened between Robert Aldrich and Victor Charles. Aldrich first directed Victor Charles in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, then followed with 4 for Texas, and then Hush Hush, Sweet Charlotte. I haven't read any news clippings explaining why Robert Aldrich and Victor Charles never worked together again. My hunch of why their creative relationship came to an end was due to a disastrous motion picture, The Strangler. Victor Charles had the leading role, but it brought him only shame and embarrassment by the poor qualities of that particular motion picture. Soon, Victor Charles was box office poison, and that might be the reason Robert Aldrich never cast him ever again.
I also read that Aldrich planned to produce a TV series called Mr. Man in 1963 that was supposed to star Victor as Sherlock Holmes, Nero Wolfe-style detective who plays a harpsichord. It said they had already filmed a pilot. I was so sad that the series never happened. It sounds really great. Do you have any idea why these projects didn't happen and why he stopped working with Aldrich?
My answer to why the television program Mr. Man never was televised was because of the motion picture The Strangler. What it appears to me is that the commercial investors financing Mr. Man yanked their financial support away, and in doing so, the project was dead. And I believe that is the true reason why Robert Aldrich never worked with Victor Charles ever again. When looking back on Victor Charles's film acting career between October 1962 and December 1964 was the most substantial body of work that he ever did. Victor Charles was working with giants like Betty Davis, Joan Crawford, Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin in those 3 films that escalated his value tremendously. And a short time later, he starred in Dean Martin's The Silencers, released on February 18, 1966, and it was then when Sinatra, Dean's Rat Pack dissolved their relationship with Victor Charles, and they never worked with him ever again. Later on, in July 14, 1972, Victor Charles acted in The Wrath of God, starring with Robert Mitchum and Rita Hayworth, and it was directed by Ralph Nelson. Those were my favorite motion pictures he acted in, and it's a shame he hadn't made more quality films, and for the rest of his acting career it didn't go kindly for him.
Maybe you can tell me a bit more about the way Victor's career went. I only know it from outside about the projects that actually happened. Maybe you know more about his motivations to take certain roles and what he thought about them.
My Uncle Victor Charles never discussed anything about his acting career with me, But after I became an actor, director, playwright, and theater critic in over 30 years, I can assess how his acting career had worked out for him. In the beginning of Victor Charles's acting career at the Old Globe Theater, it was a community theater at that time during the 1950s and early 1960s. Going up to Hollywood in those days was completely different from now. Motion picture studios brought up amateurs and unknown actors and actresses to polish their talents and turn them into money-making investments. If a potential actor or actress failed in 3 straight motion pictures, they usually would be released from their contracts and would be forgotten. Earning enough money was always on Victor Charles's mind, and most of his decisions of what roles he would play were strictly motivated by the need of money. He definitely had his share of cheesy B-grade productions, and if he wanted to remain as a professional actor, he had to put money first and quality second. That was Hollywood in those days.
I also wondered about Victor's political attitude and general convictions, because I know he was a Roman Catholic, and his piece I Am can definitely be read as an anti-abortion message. He also had a Christmas show, and in general his protest against nudity on the set of The Strangler, making it seem like he was actually a practicing Christian.
Whenever talking to my Uncle Victor Charles, it was never about politics or religion. What was discussed was only day-to-day thoughts like, "What's for lunch, Mother?" or "Have you spoken to Davy this morning?" Never did I hear a word spoken about politics at the Buono kitchen table. That goes the same for practically every family member in those days. We just didn't talk about politics or religion. Never. Being a Roman Catholic, it would be easy to conclude that he would be against women having legal abortions. But if he was still alive today, I believe he would have a change of mind by realizing women should have the right over their own bodies. Never did I ever hear him speaking about any controversial topics of religion and politics in my presence. As for nudity in motion pictures, I personally believe nudity was quite enjoyable for Victor Charles. He definitely wasn't a prude or shy of sexuality. The most important person in Victor Charles's life was his mother's opinion, and that is probably why he frowned when he was being in a film that had nudity. Also, I would guess he never had an intimate sexual affair with a woman in his life, and it possibly made him very uncomfortable seeing it before his eyes.
I didn't know about this rule that if you failed within 3 motion picture productions in a row, an actor would usually be forgotten.
I have read many hardback biographies of motion picture actors and actresses like Tyrone Powers, Douglas Fairbanks, Marlene Dietrich, Elizabeth Taylor, Cary Grant, Gloria Swanson, and on with others. During the 1930s into the 1950s, Hollywood studios like MGM and Warner Brothers would bring in new talents to discover new superstars. Many of the actors and actresses were green behind their ears, and the studios coached them and had them sign a 3 to 7 year contract. Usually, if their first 3 motion picture roles were poorly evaluated by audience fans and studio executives, then that actress or actor would die on the Hollywood vine. Once again, Hollywood's primary reason for being in the entertainment business in those days was for making money. If the new talents didn't attract and inspire paying audiences, they would soon be gone just like that.
You mentioned Judgment at Nuremberg as one of the movies of his that you like. Another fan and I tried to spot Victor in it, but we were unable to do so. Do you know when he's on screen in the movie?
Victor Charles was directed by Stanley Kramer in Judgment at Nuremberg in 1961. He only had a non-speaking role as a courtroom spectator. By casting him in this classic film, he was able to rub shoulders with numerous motion picture stars like Spencer Tracy, Judy Garland, and Burt Lancaster. I saw this film many years ago, and unfortunately, I wasn't aware that Victor Charles was in it. If and when I do see it again, I'll be squinting and looking for my Uncle Victor's face. Also, Victor Charles's imagery in the movie may have found itself lying on the editing floor. That is probably what took place, because film editors are famous for cutting people out of various scenes. The studio most likely put him in Judgment at Nuremberg so he could have a few dollars in his pocket. They do things like that for up-and-coming talents.
In one of your videos about Victor, there was a photo of him fishing. I suppose he wears one of Myrtle Bell's knitted hats?
Yes, most definitely. My grandma Mert used to spend a lot of time in her bedroom sitting and knitting hats and slippers with a Lucky Strike cigarette hanging from her mouth. I'll never forget her red lipstick on the cigarettes in the ashtray. She always wore red lipstick in the day and at night. Needless to say, she was a big smoker. I would come into her bedroom and sit on the edge of her bed, and we would talk while she knitted. I think that was the most special time when visiting with her throughout the day. Grandma Mert was always a straight shooter, and she wasn't one to entertain sissies, and she always kept you up on your toes. Victor Charles had a habit of showing America his brand new knitted hats when appearing on the Tonight Johnny Carson show.
I wanted to add another question to the topic of Victor's romantic life, if that's okay, because as I've mentioned before, I've read so many different things. To briefly summarize what I've found online, people either said he was a playboy when it came to the ladies or the men, but there was never any information about who he actually was with, even when considering the secrecy around homosexuality in the 60s. It seemed like he kept his romantic life either extremely private or there just wasn't much of a romantic life.
Right from the start, let me say, I believe Victor Charles had a vigorous sexual life, and it wasn't described as a romantic life, though. Yes, there would be secrecy for most gay men in the 1950s and going into the 1970s. For a Hollywood actor in those days, if they were caught being in a gay situation, their professional film career as an actor could be suddenly over. My father Sonny never talked poorly about his brother, Victor Charles, as possibly being a gay man, but I could tell you that it deeply bothered my father that he believed he was gay. There are no photos or film of evidence showing Victor Charles sexually touching and loving a man, and that is the truth for millions of other gay men too. It's usually done in secrecy. When I was growing up, I personally never heard or saw a woman or man kissing my Uncle Victor Charles. Whenever I was at a family event, I never heard anyone saying Victor Charles had a girlfriend or a boyfriend. Whenever being alone with my Uncle Victor Charles, he never discussed with me about sexuality, homosexuality, or if I was going out with girlfriends or boyfriends. Victor Charles was a polite man and courteous to others, and that is exactly why I believe he kept his sexual life quietly and secretively, all to himself. I've often thought about how happy Victor would be today when gays aren't seen as the plague or by his delight of coming out into the open without having any fear of losing his profession as an actor. I believe my Uncle Victor Charles was gay, and I loved him then and now and forever.
Did he later on bring a boyfriend or partner with him when the family met?
To my best knowledge and knowing what other family members recall, Victor Charles didn't ever bring an intimate boyfriend or girlfriend over to their family gatherings. His mother, Myrtle Bell, lived with him for his whole entire life, and he never had a girlfriend to kiss. What I do know is that after my step-grandfather, Victor Francis, died in 1981, Victor Charles did have a live-in young man, Richard Martinez, staying with him at his Apple Valley Ranch. With both parents gone, he had less than 1 year until his own death. Was that young man his boyfriend, lover, or just a good friend? No one will ever know the truth now, and it will always be buried as a secret, just like how Victor Charles went through his life, having it to be a secret.
I've talked to two writers who got an assignment from their publishers to write a book about Victor, one a couple of years ago and the other quite recently. But they both said these projects didn't happen at all, since there are simply not enough people alive anymore to interview to do proper research.
That is perfectly true, and even if there were friends, associates, and family members still alive who knew Victor Charles, they most likely wouldn't give any stories to them at all. As my Uncle Tony once said, Victor Charles was not one to have many close friends. I once reached out to get a conversation with actor Jonathan McMurtry to discuss his early years when they were friends at the Oak Globe Theater. Unfortunately, he didn't respond back to me, but I understood that they may have had a lot of water under the bridge that wasn't worth talking about. McMurtry most likely didn't see any reason to unbury what went on once before between Victor Charles and him. I just let it go, because some things in life are often better to stay buried and not knowing at all.
You already mentioned how you got the sad news. I wanted to ask you if you could elaborate more on the time around the day of Victor's death. In the newspapers, they said Richard Martinez, a caretaker, had found Victor at 4 a.m., but I couldn't find anything else about him.
As for Richard Martinez, his name had only surfaced because of Victor Charles's death. He had been living with him for a short time at his Apple Valley Ranch, and there is no information about who he was and where he eventually went after his death. Once again, for the men who Victor Charles associated with during his life, most of them left no clear descriptions of who they were or where they went. But Martinez is the only man known who lived with Victor Charles after his parents died.
Victor's ashes were entombed in the crypt of his mother, and many fans wondered why there wasn't at least an inscription with Victor's name added. Do you have any idea why his name isn't on the crypt?
My thought is, my Uncle Victor Charles valued his privacy. He lived the way he wanted and wouldn't allow another person to trample upon his path. He gave his heart and brilliant mind to the theater, in books, on television programs, and in motion pictures. But when it was time for him to die, he didn't want to be bothered by people placing flowers on his grave, because he would be elsewhere and not there. He lived with his mother for his entire life. Now they're together forever.
And lastly, do you think his screen career would have gotten an upswing again?
Perhaps, but you never know in Hollywood from one day to another. Victor Charles entered into Hollywood at the ending of the golden years of motion pictures in 1959. Most of the actors and actresses and directors he worked with were at their last years of popularity, like Bette Davis and Joan Crawford. He was 21 years old, playing roles of 30 years old men. He didn't connect with the hippie generation of the 1960s, and he didn't march in the streets of Vietnam War protests. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, most of the successful filmmakers overlooked Victor Charles, and he was never brought into their intimate and creative circles. Perhaps, had he lived in the 1990s, maybe they would have treated him more kindly.
You also mentioned that you worked together with Frank Gorshin, and you two talked about Batman. Did he say anything in relation to Victor?
Yes, I first met impersonator and actor Frank Gorshin at the Buonos Resort and Casino in San Diego, California in 1997. We both were hired to be in a commercial there, and I also met with and talked with country singer and actor Kenny Rogers. Gorshin and I were seated at a large circular wood table that had a substantial hole in the middle where the spinning film camera was placed. Frank was 64 years old then, and he brought his young blonde girlfriend who was probably 30 years younger than he. She was like a little mother taking care of her baby, and she was very pretty and surprisingly very nice. I could tell that they had a lot of fun together. Naturally, I brought up my uncle's name and asked Frank if they ever met together over the years after being in the Batman television series. He told me he hadn't, and he really didn't have a lot to say about Victor Charles, so I didn't push it any further than that. We had to wait for the film camera to be adjusted, so we talked about his personal career, and I told him that I was the artistic director at the Manhattan Playhouse. I was smoking cigarettes in those days, and Frank was a big smoker, and I asked him for a cigarette, and he obliged me and gave me one. As we smoked, talked, and laughed, I knew exactly what I was going to do with the cigarette butt after smoking it. I put it in my shirt pocket so I would have a memento of Frank Gorshin, and when I got home I took off my shirt and put on a t-shirt and went to the Manhattan Playhouse to direct a play. When I came back home, I went to find my shirt to get the cigarette butt, but I couldn't find it. To my surprise, my girlfriend, Jill Costanzo, had put my shirt in the washing machine when I was gone. There went my memento of Frank Gorshin. But it sure was fun talking and laughing with him that day.
Here is my impression of Victor's character after everything I've read and our talk. Please correct me if you think something's wrong. Victor was, in general, very good-natured, generous, insightful, smart, confident, witty, and sly. But he also had a bad temper that could make him very abrupt when he was angry. I think he was often quiet and introspective, but also a charismatic entertainer when in the mood. He had a strong convictions and loved acting because it was mainly a lot of fun for him, but he also took the craft very seriously.
I believe you hit the nail on the head, Larissa. Yes, he was good-natured, generous, insightful, smart, self-confident, witty, and sly. And he definitely could be angry at the drop of a dime. He was a poster child to the world, educating others that fat people are talented and intelligent too, just like others who are skinny. Whenever Victor Charles stepped onto a theater stage or stood before a motion picture camera, his charismatic presence and ingenious intellect was clearly there for all to see. My Uncle Victor Charles was a phenomenon in stature and intellect, and he always helped others to laugh. My Uncle Victor Charles died far too soon, at 43 years old in the early morning of January 1st, 1982. His professional career in television, motion pictures, and on theater stages lasted only 23 years. He was a bachelor for his entire life and hadn't any sons or daughters. His mother, Myrtle Bell, my grandma Myrt, lived with him ever since he was born on February 3rd, 1938, and she passed away on August 27th, 1979. His father, Victor Francis, passed away on May 17, 1981, leaving him alone for the first time without his two parents, and 6.5 months later, my Uncle Victor Charles Buono had joined them. Most of his intimate family members and friends had passed away by 2019, and they are Craig Knoll of the Old Globe Theater, Father John R.A. Hearn, Hollywood agent Jerry Rosen, costume designer Peggy Kellner, Auntie Susie Brittenbach, Cousin Carl Brittenbach, Granny Grunts, Uncle Ward Morris, Aunt Mary Jane Morris, Larry and Carla Morris, Uncle Tony Edwards, actor Jonathan McMurtry, my sister Teresa Erreca, my father Louis Sonny Erreca, and my beloved mother Hilda Erreca. As far as I know, there aren't any books published about Victor Charles Buono's career and life. He shall be remembered by being one of the greatest Shakespearean actors to perform in the role of William Shakespeare's Sir John Falstaff in Henry IV, Part 1 and 2. He also will be remembered as playing in the role of Edwin Flagg in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. These two sterling productions made Victor Charles Buono a Hollywood celebrity. He had the good fortune of being in the company of 4 Hollywood legends: Bette Davis, Joan Crawford, Frank Sinatra, and Dean Martin. You may just call it good luck. But any way you want to put it, Victor Charles Buono, at 20 years old, entered the shrine of Hollywood stars, and he acted his way into Hollywood history. And that can never be taken away from him forever. He was my Uncle Victor Charles, and I'm proud to say I knew him and once lived with him. I watched him performing on a theater stage and watched him put makeup on his face in his dresser room. He was my first mentor, and I'm grateful of his influences making me into an actor, director, and playwright in theater. I will always remember his gentle touch while painting an Easter egg and dabbing his brush ever so softly on its shell and moving the textures of colors as if he was painting a masterpiece of art.